I don't know if we will, but we're going to try. There's some ground to cover. We are in verses 13 down through 20. And I just want to recap a little bit. This whole chapter is talking about those that are in the midst of the Jewish people that he's writing to, the Hebrews. They've come to the point of knowing who Jesus Christ is. He's their Messiah. They've seen the work of God. They've seen the power of God. But they're about to step away from that. They came right up to the edge, but they don't make a commitment and have complete faith in him. And so when you've given that much revelation and you turn from it, as he says in the middle of the chapter, really in verse number 6, if they fall away, you can't bring them to that point again because they do a thing called apostasia, which is apostasy. They apostatize, and it hardens their heart. And we see that in several passages that we looked at of Scripture. And he was talking about in verse number 9, but things that accompany salvation. And so those who actually believed are moving on, and that was where he began in verse number 1. Let us go on. Move on from that starting point. Because some are going to fall away, and there's some that are going to go forward for Christ. And so he gets into this issue of, and we looked at the three aspects of genuine salvation, and we looked at that in several passages. In verse 10, what was the element of genuine salvation? What is the evidence? Love. That's it. That is it. So we looked at that because that was also indicative in connection, and more specifically in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, where Paul says when the gospel came to the Thessalonians, they received it as it was the word of God. They didn't receive it as the word of men, and it radically altered their life. And one of the first things he says is about that love. They demonstrated the love and their faith in that love. The second thing we find in verse number 11, it is hope. You see hope there? And again, that hope is a confident expectation based on the promises and character of God. I'm going to ask a question. Y'all ready? Can God be trusted? And that's going to be the key thing he's going to get to. Can you trust God to go forward, go on unto perfection? And in verses 13 through 20, he gives 4 reasons why you can trust him, and specifically to these Hebrew believers, why you can go on and continue to trust him. You know where there's 2 great points in which you will lose faith in God. Number 1, when things go well, and number 2, when you're down in the dumps. And that's where these things were at. But notice in verse number 12, the third aspect, faith. And so you have this issue of faith, and we'll see it again in the near future about this issue of faith. So he brings up this example in verse 13. He talks about God, but he brings in Father Abraham. And the reason he does that is because to the Jew, that was the epitome of the Jewish nation. Him and Moses, but more particularly Father Abraham. So they would go back to him. So Paul actually pulls Abraham in as an illustration. But the first thing he gives on why they can go forward in trusting God, so he does it 2 points. He does it to those who have come up to that point of salvation and haven't gotten genuinely saved, but they're tempted to go back to Judaism and the old sacrifices. He says you need to go on and get saved and then move on. And you can trust God for that. Those who are saved, it is enough for them to now go forward and press on for the growth and for the calling of God and for all those things. So he says in verse 13, for when God made promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no greater, he sware by himself, saying, surely I will bless thee, and multiplying I will multiply thee. And so after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. And so what we find in verse 13 is the reason you can trust God, and we looked at this last week, was because of his person. God is holy, righteous, and God does not lie. And that is a key thing. What I love about God is this, is any promise he makes, he has the ability to fulfill it. And you have to understand, God's eternal purpose is based on his promises. And that means if one of the promises fail, what does that do for his eternal purpose? That fails. So it messes up everything. But this God who cannot lie made promises to Abraham, and here's what I love about this, is he bound himself to Abraham and his descendants irrespective of what Abraham would do. So when you think of grace, when you think of election, that is one of the biggest aspects of election. It's connected to the Jews. And if you look at Abraham, where was Abraham when God said, "You're the one"? Does anyone know where he was at? Huh? He was in the Ur of the Chaldees. What was his family life like? Huh? No. His father was an idol maker. So he was raised in an idol maker's home. And if you study the Ur of the Chaldees, you'll find that there were some messed up issues with Ur. But God said, "You." And did Abraham immediately obey? No. Now, if you look at the original promises, well, let's go back there. Let's go back to Genesis chapter number 12. Now, I want you to understand in the same verses that we looked at in Hebrews chapter 6, verses 13 through 15, not only is it God's person, but his purpose is also a reason why you can trust him. Because God had a purpose through Abraham, and there's not one thing that Abraham could do to mess that up. Because God made a plan and a purpose, and he was going to fulfill it, and it's amazing how God does what he does. You'll notice there's a little verb in verse 1 of chapter 12. Now the Lord, say the next word, had said. When did he tell him that? Because what you find in the rest of verse 1 down through verse 3, this is a previous thing that God told Abraham. So look at what he says to him. Get thee out from thy country, which was what? The Ur of the Chaldees, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house. Okay. Now, let's go back to chapter 11 and look at the genealogy. You say, really? We're going to look at genealogy first thing Sunday morning? It's necessary that you see this. Look at verse number 25. Nahor lived after he begat Terah 119 years and begat sons and daughters. And Terah lived 75 years and begat who? Abram. His name will eventually get changed to Abraham. And he had, who was Abraham's brother? Nahor and Haran. Verse 27. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran begat Lot. So what relation was Lot to Abram? He's nephew. Good. You're on track. You're thinking. Praise the Lord. And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity in Ur of the Chaldees. And Abram and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. And there's a reason for that, because her name gets changed too. And you got to know, it gets changed to Sarah, but significance in what the names mean. Does anyone know what Sarai means? It basically means princess. And Sarah means something different, which we'll get to. The name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren. She had no children, or no child. And Terah took Abram, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son, Abram's wife. They went forth with them from the Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of where? Now, according to chapter 12, verse 1, who told Abraham to leave? But who brings Abraham out? His father, Terah. Because Terah knew Jehovah's call, or El Shaddai's call, because remember, they knew the name Jehovah, but they didn't know the full meaning, because God says in Exodus 3 that by my name I was not known. I was known as El Shaddai, the Almighty God. So that's how Abraham knew intimately God. He didn't know him intimately as Jehovah. Jehovah was for the nation of Israel, and them getting to know God that way. That's key in the near future. So Terah understood that this El Shaddai, the true and living God, placed this upon Abram, and he wouldn't leave. So Daddy had to bring him out. So Daddy brought him out of the Ur of Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. And where did they come? They came to what town? And they dwelt there. What does that mean? They pitched the tent, man. They settled down. Where was Abraham supposed to go? Canaan. Now remember back who he was supposed to separate from? His father's house. So Terah brought him out with Lot, Sarai, and those goods. So he got partial separation. I look at it this way, and you don't have to agree with me on this, but I look at it, he had a hard time leaving Daddy. He couldn't let Daddy go. So notice, and the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died where? Now, if you study, they were in Haran for a long time. How old was Terah when he had Abram? Does anyone remember? Was he 70 years? All right, so we got Abram. Now, Abram, at this point, is probably about 75 years old. And if you track it down through chapter number, so he's about 70 to 75, let's say. So he died at how old Terah did? 205 years. So think, how long were they in Haran? At least 3 decades. At least. That's 30 years. Can I just suggest to you, that is a long time to wait. So Terah dies, and do you know what then happens? Abraham is then ready to get up and get to the land of Canaan. But he wouldn't go until Daddy was gone. But you'll notice there was still someone with him from his kindred. Who was with him? Lot. And it's interesting what Genesis 13 says, that when Lot was separated from him. Okay. So that's the backdrop to this word in chapter 12, verse 1, had said. Isn't that interesting? There's that much background to had said. So he makes these promises to Abraham. We already read verse 1. Look at verse 2 of chapter 12. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. Now we find these reiterated in Hebrews chapter number 6, when Paul is writing about going on for the Lord, and confirming not only the person of God, but the purpose of God. Notice, and I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. I'm going to ask a question. I want you to think before you answer. Give me the condition clause where God would do this if Abraham acted in a certain way. Do you find an if in here anywhere? No, you do not. God said, I will, I will, I will, I will. And he did it irrespective of Abraham. Now, why did God choose Abraham? Abram. Does anyone know why? I'm about to give you the answer. You all ready? Because he chose Abraham. God has the omniscience, the holiness, the righteousness, the foreknowledge to know everything of what he's going to do and why he's going to do it. And there are some reasons that are beyond our capability. You read this in the book of Deuteronomy, where God says, I didn't choose you because there was any benefit in you. I didn't choose you because you were the greatest. As a matter of fact, you were the least amount. God made a choice and bound himself to Abraham. And it's contingent upon God to fulfill his promise. It's not contingent upon Abraham to trust in him, to be faithful. It's not contingent upon that at all, because God bound himself to this course of action. And understand, and here's how important verses 1, 2, and 3 are of Genesis 12. This is how important it is. The rest of the Bible is a revelation of those three promises. I mean, all the promises in verses 1, 2, and 3. The rest of the Bible comes about because of what God says here. The Messiah comes because of what God said to Abraham. Now, we know it goes even further back, but God solidified. So here's what he did. He made a general promise in Genesis 3:15. He made further promises with Noah. And when Noah got out of the ark, if you just read verses 24 through 27 in Genesis 9. And then he zeroed in on the nation that would come forth from Abraham. So he focused in on Abraham. And from him, all these things would come about. The scriptures would come about. Because God's promises, God's purpose will not be hinged upon what man does and what man does not do. Not upon the faithfulness of a man or an unfaithfulness of a man. And what I love about God, God has the ability to prod Abraham to keep going. And that Abraham believed him reluctantly at first, and he does get to that point where he fully trusts in him, like you read in Romans 4. But do you know that's way after Genesis 11? If you go look at Romans 4, it's talking about when God made promise to bring forth Isaac from Sarah's womb. Why did God do that? Let me ask you this. The promise to use Isaac and God would center in Isaac, was that contingent upon anything of Abraham? Absolutely not. Why? Because God's promises are based on him, and his purposes are based on him, not on our ability to fulfill them. It's based, you have to understand, your whole Christian life is based on him and his ability to through work with you, but you have to cooperate with God in that. But notice what he says here. And Abraham departed in verse number 4, as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. So again, not completely as the Lord had said unto him, but we'll give it that. And Abraham was 75 years old. Does anybody need a definition on what 70 and 5 are? I know it's math. So notice, and he departed out of Haran. So isn't that interesting? That we're back to chapter 11, verse 32. So again, have this in context. I stress this because you have to understand, does God abide faithful even when we don't believe? We lose blessing. We lose, but I'm grateful that my salvation is not based on what I do or don't do. It's based on what Jesus Christ did. So notice, and Abraham took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their substance, and they left, and they got to the land of Canaan. And does everyone remember what happens in the land of Canaan? Famine hits, so they got to go down to Egypt. Do you remember when they get into Egypt, what Abraham does? He lies about Sarai. She's beautiful. Wait a minute, this is an old lady. You got to understand, God sustained her. God gave her vigor back to her life. And Abraham, so she's doing her thing. She's walking about, and Pharaoh takes notice of her. And, oh, she's a pretty woman. And he starts thinking that he would want to have her in his harem. And God shows up on the scene, doesn't he? Now, why did he stop that? Why did he stop Pharaoh from having any kind of relation with Sarah? Sarah was chosen. Did God have a purpose for Sarah? We'll just call her Sarah because that's what we're used to calling her. He had a purpose for her. And will God protect his purpose? Now, wait a minute. Abraham lied. What did he say to Pharaoh? It was half a lie. It was a half a lie is a full lie, man. It was his sister. And then Pharaoh sees, wait a minute, something's not right here. Why are you playing with her like that? And he's like, Abraham, get in here. So Abraham comes in, and God sends a dream to Pharaoh and says, if you touch her, I'll kill you. Let me tell you, that was a loud and clear dream to Pharaoh. He gets up, he goes, why did you do this to us? Now, think. God had a purpose that he was going to bring forth Abraham and bring forth through Sarah. And God protected that purpose and guarded that purpose in spite of Abraham's lies, in spite of Abraham's misgivings, in spite of his mess-ups, in spite of him not fully in compliance with what God told him. Okay? So, we get to chapter 13. Conflict between the herdmen of Lot and the herdmen of Abram. And they get so tense that they have to separate. Abram gives Lot the choice land. And guess what he chooses? He chooses the plains because they were well watered like Egypt. So he got a taste for Egypt when his uncle Abraham brought him down to Egypt. So he gets that, and when they separate, and I want you to see this in chapter 13. Verse number 11, chapter 13, verse 11. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. Abraham dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent toward Sodom. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. Verse 14. And the Lord said unto Abraham, after that Lot was separated from him, lift up now thine eyes and look. It wasn't till Lot was separated from him. Think about how many mess-ups that Abraham has already done. Can Abraham mess up the purpose of God? No, he cannot. So, look over, if you would now, at chapter 15. God shows up to him, and him and Abraham have this discussion, and God lays out to him what he's going to do. And Abraham is concerned about who's going to be the one to take and carry on these things, and God says, don't worry about that. He goes, well, I got this one, and God says, that's not the one. And look, if you would, at verse 17. And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, behold, a smoking furnace and burning lamp that passed between those pieces. Now, if you want to understand what that is you go back to verse 10, because God told him there would be a sacrifice made because a covenant was going to be brought in. So what happened is in these days, this is confirmed they did this on a normal basis. They literally would cut the animal in half. Half would go over here, half would go over there. And what would happen is that the two individuals that were making the covenant, not just promises, not a contract, they were literally covenanting together under the eyes of God. And so they would walk through the parts together. Okay. When you get here, you find Abraham does not walk through with God. God walks through with himself. Because these promises and the purpose of God are not hinged upon what Abraham does or doesn't do. They're hinged on the purpose of God, and God will not leave it to a man to accomplish this, in the sense that if man in all his frailty will mess it up. Not might, not maybe, will mess it up. This again is revealing the sovereignty of God. Now please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I am not talking about salvation and election. That's not what this is. We find in Genesis 15, verse 6, Abraham had to still get saved, or what we would call saved. He had to believe in God. But the purpose of God, God was doing this even before he was justified before God. He did this in his unsaved state. You say, does God do that? Yes. Has God worked with any of you before you were saved? Did God do things in your life? Mr. Harthen, he was evident in your life before you ever came to know him as Savior. You've shared that so many times, and it still astounds me how, when you look back before you were saved, what God did to bring you to that. He sovereignly moved you, but you didn't realize he was doing that. But you had to make the choice to get saved. But God was working behind the scenes to bring you about to that point. Abraham believed him in verse 6. God justified him and declared him righteous and charged to his account. And you'll look at verse 6, counted it to him for righteousness. So now God says, I want you to understand something, Abraham. I am going to bind myself even further now to this course of action that I told you. Now you got to understand, God didn't just come up with this idea. He knew this from eternity past before the foundation of the world, that he was going to use Abraham. You say, how does he do that? I don't know. Welcome to the club. Verse 17. And it came to pass that when the sun went down and it was dark, Abraham, if you look at verse number 12, is asleep. And he now has this vision there, and he sees this smoking furnace and burning lamp. That's God walking through with God. That's what that is. Passed between the two pieces, in the same day the Lord made a what? And what I love about chapter 12, verse number, if you look, go back to chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3. Tell me, what tense are the promises of God in? Hopefully you can think grammatically right now. What tense? Oh no. Look at what he says. Verse 2, I will. Past, present, or future, future. Verse 2, I will bless thee. Past, present, or future. Thou shalt be a blessing. Past, present, or future. And I will bless thee. Past, present, or future. Okay. What do you find in chapter 15? Now the covenant that God said, I will, is now going to be enforced. Why? Because God has brought Abraham along, and he is now at that point where he's exercised faith. Now God will infuse and initiate that covenant with him. I love the fact that between chapter 12 and chapter 15, you see God sovereignly moving, and a man that didn't have a clue what was going on, and God still was able to bring his fulfillment of promise and fulfillment of his purpose up to this point for Abraham. And we could go through this because we know so many times that even Sarah messed things up, did she not? Does everyone remember what happened in Genesis 17? I mean chapter 18, I think it is. Does everyone remember? Well, you know, God is not bringing this about through me, so it must be through my handmaid. So let me give another woman to Abraham. So what kind of relationship is that? Adulterous. All right. But wait a minute, he married her. So, wait, think. Did she get pregnant? Does Hagar get pregnant? All right. So he had another woman, had another baby. Did that mess up the plan of God? Did it mess up the purpose of God? Absolutely not. Did God work even through that? You better believe it. Did Abraham and Sarah get things right with God? Did they doubt? Did Sarah not believe at all? How much did she not believe? She laughed not only in unbelief, but she literally derided God. And you look, and there's so many different things about that are very interesting. And you look at these situations, and none of that derails God's purpose. The point is this: the sovereign God and what he has purposed, man cannot add to it, cannot subtract from it, and cannot change it. It will be done. And it's an amazing thing. Do you know there's something in your life that will be done no matter what? Because it's not based on you, it's based on God. Does anyone know? It's called predestination. Does anyone know what you're predestined to? No, well, it is appointed, yeah. I mean, but for a believer, you are predestined. No. No. Watch what I'm going to give you what you're predestined to. Go over to Romans chapter 8. Y'all know this verse. Well, that's all things work together for good to them who love God, who are the called according to his purpose. I want you to look, if you would, at verse number 29. For whom he did foreknow, he also did what? To what end? So tell me, what has God predestined you to? To be conformed to the image of Jesus Christ. You will arrive at glorification. You will be made like Jesus Christ. Right? Does anyone know Philippians 3:21? No. That we will have a body fashioned like unto his. 1 Corinthians 15. Notice what he says here, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom God did, he did predestinate. He called them that were called, they were, and them that were justified were. So is there any question that you're going to arrive at glorification? No. How many that got predestined arrived at glorification? How many got lost along the way? Now here's what this means, is when God saves you, there's not one thing you can do to mess that up. Now, blessings are suspended. You're going to have to face the judgment of God. But here's what's awesome about it. You will arrive where God says you're going to be. Because it's not based on you, it's based on him. Let me give you another verse. Who knows Philippians 1:6? This very thing that he, good work in you, keep going, will perform it unto how long? Until the day of Jesus Christ. So, does that mean I can disobey God? Let me ask it a different way. Do I have the freedom to disobey God? Yes. Will that mess up his plan and purpose of what he's doing? No. Will he chasten us? Yes. Will he come after us and deal with us? Yes. But you know, through all of this, he is going to get you to where you're supposed to go. Now, the best thing for you in your life is to cooperate with God and to grow and to trust him. I love what 1 or 2 Timothy says. He abides faithful even when we don't believe. You know, this all flows out of Father Abraham. All comes back from Genesis. So go back to Hebrews if you would. You needed to understand this because from Abraham is brought his descendants. Now, in the original promise that God made to them, to Abram, did God say anything about his descendants? And I will multiply thee. Descendants will be there. When you read Genesis 15, God says, I will multiply thy seed, and they shall be like the sands of the seashore. And he says, and I'm going to give you this land. What land? Where did Abram leave Ur of Chaldees to go to what land? The land of Canaan. That's the promised land. Whose promise was it? God. How on the way to the promised land, the descendants of Abraham, how many times did they mess up? How much on that first round lost their lives because they refused to believe? That whole generation was gone. Did that mess up the plan of God? Did it mess up the purpose of God? Now here's what I love about it. What happened when God was angry with the nation of Israel and he told Moses something? Does anybody remember what he told Moses? I want to wipe out the whole nation. Do you remember what he said to Moses? And I'll start anew with you. Could God have done that? Oh yeah. Do you know contained in the genes of Moses were the 12 tribes of Israel? Did y'all know that? Yeah, he had the genes of his brothers. Y'all know that, right? Do you know you have the genes of your father and your mother? Do you know that they can tell your brothers and sisters that you're genetically connected? So all of them are in there. I love that. Why? Because, folks, God's purpose is going to be fulfilled. So with all that as a backdrop, look at Hebrews chapter 6 again. So when God made promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no greater, he swore by himself. Okay? God bound himself. Does anyone know what aspect of God swears by? What part of his character? There's a specific part that he swears by. And what is interesting about this is it reveals to us that there is the greatest aspect of God. Because it says here, when you take an oath, you swear by the greater. But there's no one greater to God. So who does God swear by? Himself. But he took an oath, and it says this, to David, he swore by a specific aspect of himself. Nope. His holiness. Once have I sworn unto my servant David by my holiness. So that is the greatest aspect of God. Not his love, not his mercy, not his forgiveness, his holiness. He's a holy God. So Abram gets this promise from God, and God swears and binds himself to this, and the purpose of God will be fulfilled. And we've seen the promise in verse number 14. Surely blessing I will bless thee, and multiplying I will multiply thee. And so after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. Did Abraham get any of the promises? He got some, but he did not get all. Because God is still, has the nation of Israel really messed it up? Were they set aside? Were they annihilated as a nation and disbanded to the four corners of the earth? Absolutely. Do you think that's going to frustrate the purpose of God? Will God's purpose for the nation of Israel still be fulfilled? That's what Romans 9, 10, and 11 are all about. God will. Do you know why that is? Because of what God made promise to Abraham. Do you know Israel being brought to the land in the future, and what we see happening today is because of what God promised to Abraham over 4,000 years ago? Now talk about a God who said, I'm going to keep my purpose intact. That no one, no human, no nation, Hitler can't even mess that up. Because it's not based on him. So, by the way, does everyone know what the divine purposes of Israel were for? And what they rejected and what they didn't do? Does everyone know? There are 7 purposes that God brought the descendants of Abraham, which became the nation of Israel, and they were inaugurated as a nation at Mount Sinai. Who was their king at Mount Sinai? God. Remember what in 1 Samuel chapter 8, what God says? That I was their king, I led them, but they have rejected me. Samuel, they have not rejected you, they've rejected me. Remember that? All right. That kingship started in Mount Horeb. I lost you. I'm losing you. Here's the point. If you want to know what the 7 purposes of Israel are, see me afterwards, I can give them to you, because they failed every single one of them. They didn't fulfill any of them. As a matter of fact, they became isolated.